Oh, good morning. Today's Daf Yomi is Yevamos Daf Yevamos 44, and we're going to start at the Mishnah on the bottom of 43b. So, what does the Mishnah tell us? Arba Achin. Let's say you have four brothers, and we're going to see from the Gemara that it's really more than four brothers. But let's say you have four brothers who die. That's how the Gemara understands it. But there are Arba Achin. There are four brothers. Nisu and Arba Nashim, and these four brothers are married to four women, Umesu, and then these four brothers die. Imrata Hagadol Shabahem, if the oldest one, and the way the Gemara understands this is, if the oldest one of the surviving brothers wants Yabim Eskuan to do Yibam with all of them, to marry all four of the widows, Harishus Piyado, he has the permission to do it. Mishai and Nasai Shtei Nashim, if somebody was married to two women, Umeis, so one brother was married to two women, and then this brother dies, then the surviving brother just has to do Yibam or Chalitza with one of the widows, and then the other widow is allowed to marry whoever she wants from the market. So basically, if there are two women, if the brother was married to two widows, then you only need to do Yibam or Chalitza with one of them. On the top of Mem Daled Amud Aleph says the Mishnah, if one of the brothers, if one of the women was Keshera, i.e., she was allowed to marry a Kohen. Why? Because she had never been divorced prior to this. That's one reason why she might be allowed to marry a Kohen. Another reason, which we'll see, maybe because she had never been involved in a prohibited relationship. So if one of the women was Keshera and the Achas Pesua and the other woman was disqualified, then Im Hayacholitz Lepsua. Then if you need to do Chalitza, if you were planning on doing Chalitza, do it with the one who's already disqualified. Because why should you make another woman disqualified to marry the Kohen? Just have the one who's already disqualified. So do the Chalitza with her, because the Chalitza is a quasi-divorce, and so therefore she's going to become prohibited to marry a Kohen. So therefore, if one of them was already disqualified, and you're going to do Chalitza, do it with the one who's disqualified. And if you were planning on doing Yibum, then Miyabim L'Kshera. Then if you're planning on doing marriage, then you could even do it with the one who is kosher. But if you're planning on doing the Chalitza, specifically do it with the woman who's already been disqualified for a Kohen. Why should you make two people disqualified for the Kohen? And the way the Gemara is going to explain it, and Rashi already tells us in advance, is a person shouldn't throw out the water from his pit when other people need it. I mean to say, why ruin it for the Kohanim? Make there one more Jewish woman who the Kohanim can marry. So now the Gemara tells us, Arba Achin, do you really think that there are only four brothers? Well, if that's the case, who's going to marry the widows? Ela Ema Arba Me'achin. No, four of the brothers die. So if four of the brothers die, then the other brothers who are surviving, are one of them, the oldest amongst them, has the first right, and he can marry even all of the widows. Harishus Biyado. He has the permission to marry all the widows. So the Gemara says, Vishavkile, are we really going to allow him to marry all the widows? Matanya, but we learned in the Brisa, the Karuo Ziknei Iro. The Brisa says that the elders of the city shall call out to him. That's based upon the verse that says in Deuteronomy 25, the elders of the city shall call out to him and speak to him. So what does that mean? V'karu ziknei iro, hein v'lo shluchan, that they are the ones who call out to him and not their agents. V'dibru elav, and they speak to him. Melamed shemesin lo etza hogenes. This teaches us that the elders of the city give to the one who's coming to do Yibam or Chalitza, we give him good advice. Shemayahu Yeled, if the one who's coming to do Yibam was a younger person, but he's a Kenai, and the widow is older, who's Yalda, or it's the opposite. He's older and she's younger. Omer lo, we say to him, Malcha Itzel Yalda, why are you with a younger person? Malcha Itzel Zakena. We say to him, why are you with an older woman? Eitzel Shakemoscha, go be with somebody who's similar to you in age. Va'altasim kitata b'veisecha, and don't make a fight in your home unnecessarily. So if that's the case, the Gemara's assumption is that how is he going to provide for all of these women? So it's four wives is a lot of wives to provide for. So how is he going to provide? So are we really going to allow one man to marry four wives? Gemara says, no, it's tzricha de avshalei. Now we're talking about a case where he has a lot of money, so he's able to provide for it. So Gemara says, I feel tuvanami. Well, then the number four seems, excuse me, the number four seems kind of random. Why they specifically pick four people? So the Gemara explains. Eight to Tova Kamashwan. It's giving us good counsel. What's the counsel? Dalad in Phalo. That if you have four wives, that's the maximum that you're allowed to have. Why? Because the husband has to be with his wife on a period of a marital intimacy at least once a month. And because the Torah scholar, the way of a Torah scholar, Rashi tells us, based upon the Torah scholar is intimate with their wives once a week, and so therefore, if if he has four wives, he's going to be with each of the wives one night a month, and so therefore, that's the minimum that a husband should be with their wife, and so therefore, more than four wives is not fair to her. Misha haya nasoi. So we had said that if somebody we had said in our Mishnah that if somebody was married to two women and he dies, then Yibam or Chalitza with one of those women is sufficient. So the Gemara says, well, why? Really, we should have had this sugya at the very beginning of our tracking. We're already on page 44, and now we're bringing up this basic law about Yibam. But why doesn't he do Yibam with both of them? What's the reasoning? So the Gemara explains, Amar B'chia Baraba, Amar B'Yochanan, Amar Kra, it's based upon the verse, Asher lo yivneh, it's based on Chiv. It says in the verse that when you do chalitza, that it says in the verse, this is what you do to the man who does not build the house of his brother. She removes his shoe and spits on the ground. Meaning to say, he's supposed to build one home and not two homes. And therefore, he only does yibum with one of the women and not two. So the Gemara says, well, why doesn't he do chalitza to both? Why doesn't he do chalitza to both? So the Gemara explains, no, that also wouldn't work. Amar Zutra Bar Tuvi Amar Kra base chalutza now. That you call his name is called in amongst Israel the house of the removed shoe. One house is a removed shoe, but not two houses. Meaning to say that it's only done once. So the Gemara says, well, why doesn't he do yibum with one and then do chalitza with the other one? First do yibum with one woman and then do chalitza with the other widow. Gemara says, Amar Kra, no, we're not going to say that because it says im lo yachbotz. Because it says if he does not want to do yibum, then he does chalitza, which implies hachafetz that if he wants to do it yiyabim, then he only does yibum. And kol yibum ol chalitza. And whoever does yibum, any person that is able to do yibum with, he's able to do chalitza with. Kol she'eno el yibum, and anyone who's not capable of doing yibum with, ein ol chalitza. Therefore, he cannot do chalitza with such a person. And so, therefore, anybody who does not come to the court to do yibum, such a person, you're not able to do chalitza, and so therefore, he only does yibum with the first one because since he can't do yibum with the second one, therefore, he doesn't do chalitza with her. The Gemara says, and furthermore, Shalol Yomru, base miktaso banoi, bias miktaso banoi, umiktaso chalitz. We don't want people to say that this is a house where partially it has yibum and partially it has chalitza. The Gemara says, V'yomer, what do we care? What's the problem with doing a chalitza after you do a yibum? The Gemara says, if you do yibum and then chalitza, yeah, that is possible. But that would technically not be a problem to do yibum followed by a chalitza, because what is the problem there? Ella, but the problem is still mecholitz v'hadam yabam. But we're worried that maybe you would do first chalitza and then do yibum. And really, once you've done the chalitza, you're disqualified to marry the other widow, and so therefore that's a problem because you're in violation of the prohibition of being with your brother's wife in a situation where you're not allowed to. The kamlei below yivneh. Once you do the chalitza, then you're included in the prohibition of lo yivneh. And so therefore, since you're in that prohibition, therefore you're not allowed, we're worried that you might do that. But maybe when there's one wife, then you're going to have the mitzvah of Yibum, ki katarti. But when there's two wives, maybe lo tiskayim mitzvah Yibum. Maybe there's no Yibum there at all. So maybe there's maybe there's no Yibum when there's two widows. Gemara says no. Imkain tzaras erva the asar rachmana. We know that the Torah, we had learned this at the beginning of our tractate, that the Torah prohibits you to be with the co-wife of an erva. It's the first Mishnah, that there are 15 women who are exempt and their co-wives are exempt because they're relatives. And we base this upon a verse. So if that's the case, the 15 women who are the tzara of the erva, that the Torah tells us that these 15 categories of the co-wife of the relative is prohibited. Well, if every situation where there were two women who fell to Yibum, you don't do Yibum. So why do we need to say this? If we say that two women in general are not falling into the category of chalitza and yibum, so for sure you don't need to tell us about the co-wife of an erva. If the women themselves, if the two women are never fall into the category of yibum, for sure the co-wife of an erva does not fall into yibum. So the Gemara says, but that's not necessarily a good argument. It's just, you might have said you need it. Why? You might have thought erva abrai kaima v'tisyabim tzarasa. You might have thought that the erva is considered outside, external, and therefore you do the yibum with the co-wife. Like Rashi says, Komar v'ish te banim batim ba'alma patura. Like you could say, so meaning to say, you might say that since the erva, the relative, is considered like she's not even part of the yibum scenario, and so therefore the co-wife is only the one wife that exists there that you can do yibum with, and so therefore you might have thought you would do yibum under that situation. Kamashmo and asira. So we see from here, that's why perhaps we need this concept to teach us that the co-wife is prohibited. So therefore, what's the reason why we don't? Then what's the reason why we know that if there's two wives that you still have to do yibum with one of them, because yevimto riba, because it says the word yevimto twice in the pasuk. It says so it says the word yevimto, his yevama, twice, and that teaches us that even in a situation where there's two women who fall to yibum, you would still be required to do yibum. So we say if one of the women was kashera and one of the women was pesua, we mean to say kashera to marry a kohen and the other one was disqualified, only do the yibum, only do the chalitza with the woman who's already disqualified. Why? Amar Rav Yosef kan shana Rabbi taught, a person should not throw out the water from his pit if other people need it. So therefore, don't disqualify this woman from marrying a kohen unnecessarily. So since one of the women is kosher to marry a kohen, the other one is disqualified, only do the chalitza, which is a quasi-divorce, and would disqualify her from marrying a kohen, with the woman is already disqualified. Now we're up to the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah says, "Amachzir grushaso," somebody who remarries their divorced wife. Here, what are we referring to? We're referring to a situation where the woman was divorced from the man, and then she married another person, and now he remarries her. Hamachzir grushaso, which is a prohibition. Also, another prohibition. A man marries a woman who he already gave chalitza to, and that's included in the category of lo yivne, that once you have done chalitza with her, you're no longer allowed to marry her. Vanose krovas chalutzaso, or somebody who marries the relative of his chalutza. Yotzi vavlan mamzer. That such a person, the marriage is to terminate, and the offspring is a mamzer. The offspring is his bastard child. This is according to the position of Rabbi Akiva, Divrei Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva says even though it's a regular prohibition, the offspring is still going to be a mamzer. The Chachamim say ein avlan mamzer. The Chachamim say the offspring is not a mamzer. Chachamim say the offspring is not a mamzer under those circumstances, because we'll see the Chachamim are going to be in a position that a higher level of prohibition is required in order to create a mamzer. Modim, but the Chachamim are moda, they admit, benose krovas krushaso, where somebody marries the relative of his divorced wife, that is shavlan mamzer, that under those circumstances, the offspring is a mamzer. Rashi says, the krushaso ke'ishto, because the divorced wife is like his wife, and so therefore, If you marry her sister or mother, that's what's going to be a kares penalty. And therefore, the offspring would be a mamzer under those categories. So the Gemara says, V'savar Rabbi Akiva hanose krovas chalutzaso avlad mamzer, which Rabbi Akiva really in the position that if you marry the relative of your chalutza, of this woman who you did chalitza with, that the offspring is a mamzer. Does Rabbi Akiva really have that position, which is what our Mishnah said? So I'm a Reish Lakish, but didn't Reish Lakish teach us? Kan shana Rebbe achos krusha midivrei Torah achos chalutza midivrei sofrim. But didn't we have this case already in our Masechta back on Mem Amud Beis that Rebbe taught the sister of your divorced wife? That's a biblical prohibition, but the sister of your chalutza, that's only a rabbinic prohibition. So if that's the case, how can Rabbi Akiva say that she is that the offspring of the krovas chalutzaso is going to be a mamzer? So the Gemara explains that what's the answer? The Gemara says, Tani krovas grushaso. First attempt of the Gemara is to say, let's change the text of the Mishnah and don't say it's the relative of your chalutza, but say it's the relative of your divorced wife. And hachinami mistaber. And indeed, the Gemara wants to say that's the most logical way to read our Gemara. The Katani Seifa, because the last line of our Mishnah states, Umodim benose kruvas grushaso shavad mamzer, that the rabbis admit that if you marry the relative of your divorced wife, that the offspring is a mamzer. Now, if you would want to say bishlama, Iri, Ba, that if you want to say that the Mishnah was referring earlier to the case of the sister of your divorced wife, that's really what our Mishnah is talking about, not the sister of a chalutza, but the sister of a divorced wife. Hainu de Ketanu Modim. Well, that's why it makes sense to say that the rabbis are saying, well, we admit in that circumstance. But if you're saying that the Mishnah was not referring to that case at all, Mayu Modim, then why all of a sudden are they bringing up that they admit in the case of a divorced wife's relative that the offspring is a mamzer? But if the Mishnah wasn't talking about that until now, why would they bring it up? So therefore, it's proof that we should amend the text of the Mishnah from a krovas chalutza, so from the relative of your chalutza to the relative of your divorced wife. The Gemara says, well, not so fast. Dilma hakamashma. Maybe what the Mishnah is saying at the end when it says the rabbis admitted in the case of a relative of a divorced wife, maybe all it's admitting is the yesh mamzer michai de krisus. Maybe all it's admitting is that there is a mamzer from the case of a krisus, meaning to say that maybe it's teaching us the rabbi's position is that if it's a penalty, if it's a prohibition of kares, that it makes a mamzer. So the Gemara says, and that's why it brings in the case of the relative of a divorcee. The Gemara says, Hakatani lala kaman, but this is taught explicitly later on in our tractate on Mem Tes. It says, Ezu mamzer, what's considered a mamzer? Kol she'er basar, shehu below yavo, divrei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says every relative who's including the prohibition of lo yavo, that you're not allowed to come into the community. So every relative who's included in that prohibition is going to be a mamzer. Whereas Rabbi Shimon HaTimani Omer, Kol shechayivin alav kares b'dei shamayim. Shimon HaTimani says, and this seems to be the position of the Chachamim in our Mishnah, anybody who's liable for kares from heaven. And the halacha kedvarav, and the law is like Rabbi Shimon HaTimani. So we see that later on in our tractate, we're going to say explicitly that anything where there's a kares penalty, the sages say that the law is a mamzer. So why would they need to say it here? V'dilma kasasim lantana Rabbi Shimon HaTimani. Well, maybe that's what we're being taught here, that the Mishnah is telling us that the law is like Rabbi Shimon HaTimani. Gemara says, well, that doesn't make sense either. Imkain wisni sharcha v'kruisus. That's the case. Why would it randomly just pick the relative of a divorcee? It should have listed the other penalty, the other relationships which are kares penalty. Krovas grushaso lamali. Why did it say specifically the relative of a divorcee? Now, shmamina iriba. So it must be that the Mishnah was earlier talking about not about the relative of a chalutza, but the relative of a divorcee. Gemara says, "V'delma olamo iriba," but maybe it was not referring to the relative of a chalutza. V'aidi ditani machzir grushaso v'nosa chalutzaso v'krovas chalutzaso tani nami krovas grushaso. Maybe it was not referring to the relative of a divorcee earlier. It's just that since our Mishnah had anyways referred to one who remarried their divorced wife, and then one who married their chalutza, and then the relatives of a chalutza, Therefore, it also tells us about the relative of a divorcee, because it's kind of the same type of category. Well, if that's the case, Krovas it's also Rabbi Akiva, Have Mamzer. So if that's the case, then we're left with the astonishing position that even though the other sources that we had said earlier back on Daf Mem, that the relative of a divorcee is biblically prohibited, but the relative of a chalutza is rabbinically prohibited, that's not consistent with Rabbi Akiva's position. Rabbi Akiva would be of the position that the relative of a chalutza is indeed a mamzer. And Amar Rabbi Akiva bar Abba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Haynu Taimada Rabbi Akiva. Why does Rabbi Akiva adopt this position when the relative of a chalutza is indeed a mamzer? The Amar Kra base chalutza now, hakasav karo beso. The Torah calls the woman who removed the shoe, the woman who had chalitza with the man, the Torah calls her his wife, Beiso, his house, and so therefore her relatives are going to be also biblically prohibited to the brother-in-law, and so therefore the offspring is a mamzer. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Shimon bar Revi, Hakol Modin. Everybody admits, b'machzer grushaso, in a situation where you remarry your divorced wife, everybody admits shavvad pogrom, that the offspring of such a union where you remarry your divorced wife, that the offspring is pogrom l'kahuna, is going to be disqualifying from marrying a Kohen. Rashi says, "V'im yolda bas psul kahuna techalola," and if you gave birth to a girl, then she would be disqualified from being able to marry a Kohen. So everybody says the offspring of such a union, even not only Rabbi Akiva, but everybody says that the offspring is defective. They lose their status as a Kohen, and they can no longer marry a Kohen. So the Gemara says, "Man hakol modim." Who is the one? Everybody agrees that the offspring of such a union is pogrom. So Shimon. So who is that? Shimon Atimani. This must be referring to the case of Shimon Atimani, who's the one who argues with Rabbi Akiva. The Afakav the Amar Shimon Atimani. That even though Shimon Atimani says ein mamzer michai ve'lavin, even though Shimon Atimani says that the offspring of just a regular prohibition, like somebody who remarries a divorced wife, is not going to be considered a mamzer. Nevertheless, the mamzer will have. Granted, they're not a mamzer, but pogrom miyahavi. But the offspring is defective. And how do we know that? Mikal v'chomer mi'almana. We're going to learn it out from a logical argument from a widow. What's the argument? Ma almana l'kohen gadol. Sheini surah shava b'kol b'na pogrom. Just like a widow to a kohen gadol, which is, excuse me. It's like a widow to a kohen gadol, where the prohibition is not on anybody else other than a kohen gadol. It's enu surah shava b'kol, but nevertheless, b'na pogrom. Her offspring is going to be, her son is pogrom and is disqualified as a kohen. And so therefore, if she gave birth to a daughter, the daughter is not able to marry a kohen. So nevertheless, so kavachomer zu she'isura shava b'kol. This one this one whose prohibition is equal to all, meaning to say, the machzir grushasa, the one who remarries a divorced wife, this is a prohibition that's upon all of Israel. For sure, we would say enodin shebena pagam. For sure, if she gives birth to a daughter, she cannot marry a kohen. Gemara says, but that's not a strong kabel chomer, because iko and mifrach, we could challenge that kabel chomer. Why? We could say mala almana shekain hi atzma mitchalelos. The widow herself, she herself becomes disqualified to marry the kohen, and so therefore she's not. That if this kohen gadol dies as a result of the fact that she married him when she wasn't allowed to, she herself is not allowed to marry a kohen, and so therefore. It's not a strong kal chomer. Unlike a machzir grushaso, that she herself does not become disqualified as a result of this relationship, because, meaning to say, she was already prohibited to the kohen from the moment she was divorced, and there's nothing that's being added to this prohibition. And also, let's say she would become divorced from this union, and she has no children. She goes back to her father's home. She could eat from the truma, and so therefore That's one way we could break this Kal V'chomer. A second way we could break this Kal V'chomer is that it states, V'od hito'ev aksiv. It says about this remarrying your divorced wife. It says she is an abomination, which means she is an abomination. If the aim banah to oven, but her offspring are not to oven. Her offspring are not abominations, and so therefore her offspring could marry a Kohen. And third, v'od Tanya hamachzer grushasa v'anose chalutzaso v'anose krovas chalutzaso. We learned in the Brisa, one who remarries their divorced wife, or one who marries their chalutza, or one who marries a relative of the chalutza, or the kiva omer, ein lo ba kedushin, ein atzricha haimenu get v'hipsua uvada pasol l'kofen osoa hotzi. Rabbi Kiva says, under those circumstances, it's not considered a valid marriage. She does not need a divorce. She is disqualified, the offspring is disqualified, and we force the marriage to terminate. Whereas the Chachamim say, Yesh lo ba kedushin. The Chachamim say it is a valid marriage. The Chachamim say it is a valid marriage. The Chachamim also say that tzricha imenu get. The Chachamim also say she requires a get. V'hi kshira. She is kosher to marry to she is not disqualified. She can still eat the truma. Uvada kosher, and her offspring can eat from, and her offspring can marry a Kohen. So Raman, so doesn't it mean when it says her offspring is kosher, doesn't it mean excuse me, doesn't it mean Rav Kahuna? Doesn't it mean her offspring can marry into the Kohanim? And so therefore we see from here that there's explicit brisa that the Chachamim say that she's not a mamzer from Chavi Lavin, and in that situation her offspring is not disqualified. And isn't this a contradiction to Rabbi Yosef, who says that the offspring is defective? Gemara says no, it means lo l'kahal. She's still disqualified from marrying the Kohen, but her offspring is kosher to marry into the regular community. So it says the Gemara, Yahachi, he kshera, when it says that she is kosher, what does that mean? Obviously she can marry into the community. Mishum Tazanya, Ifsal Kahal, because she had this prohibited relationship, she would become disqualified to marry into the community. We never have such a circumstance. Elav Kahuna must mean that she's disqualified to marry the Kohanim. Kahuna, and from the fact that she is prohibited to marry with the Kohanim, also her offspring also. Gemara says no, midei area. No, that's not the way to read it. Hakadisa. Each one, mutatis mutandis, is going to be applied to the case that's most appropriate. Meaning to say that she's going to be prohibited to marry into the community, and her offspring are prohibited to marry with the Kohanim. And hachinami mistaber. That's how Rabbi Yosef would explain it. And that's how Rabbi Yosef would explain it. And this is the most logical way to read it, the Katani Reisha, because it says in the first clause, Hi psua uvada pasal. It says in the first clause, she is disqualified and her offspring is disqualified. Hi psua laman. Who is she disqualified to? Ilay kahal. Do you want to say she's disqualified to the community? Mishum dezanya ivsalei kahal, because she had this promiscuity, this prohibited relationship. She's disqualified to the community. It doesn't make sense. Alavu kahuna. It must mean she's disqualified to the kahuna. Uvada apostle, and her offspring is disqualified. Laman, who is her offspring disqualified to? Ilay kahuna. If you want to say to the kahuna, halakahal kosher. If you mean to the community, it's kosher. I'm Rabbi Akiva Vlad Mamzer. So the Rabbi Akiva says the offspring is a mamzer. It's el pshita lekahal. So it means that her offspring is disqualified, according to Rabbi Akiva, to marry into the community. With the Reisha, from the fact that in the Reisha with Rabbi Akiva, each one is applying to the category that fits it best. Seifanami hakadisa v'hakadisa. And so we see from here that this is support for Rabbi Yosef's position, that we're saying that the offspring is, according to Rabbi Shimon HaTeimani, will be disqualified to marry the Kohanim. But the Gemara says, but there were still two other proofs that we tried to break Rabbi Yosef's Kal V'chomer. And one was Rabbi Yosef had said, that when Rabbi Yosef brought the Kal V'chomer from a widow, the Gemara said, well, she's an abomination, but her offspring are not an abomination. Hitoeva nami. So what would Rabbi Yosef say? Hitoeva v'ein sarasa toeva. No, the verse means she's considered to be prohibited to marry into the Kohanim, meaning to say that she loses her right to eat the truma, but not her, or to marry other Kohanim, but not her offspring, but not her co-wife. To Avin, but her offspring, they indeed would become prohibited to marry to the Kohanim. Well, what about the fact that we have the first attempt to break Rav Yossi's Kal V'chomer? That how can you derive a proof from the widow that the widow is something that's not a prohibition that's shava l'kol? It's only on the Kohen Gadol, and this is a prohibition that's equal to everybody. So you can't derive a Kal V'chomer from a widow to everyone else. A widow could be a more stringent law. So the Gemara says, "El almana kasha." So the Gemara says, "No, mal almana shekain hi atzma mischaleles." The Gemara says. So the Gemara says, no, the widow is different because she herself becomes disqualified and is prohibited to marry the Kohen, and that's not the case by the regular divorcee. And so therefore, you can't learn out from here that that her offspring is defective, like the law of a widow to the Kohen Gadol. You can't learn that out from the case of the Machzir Krushaso. So the Gemara says, if Rav Yosef taught something, this is actually what Rav Yosef taught. What did Rav Yosef teach? Rav Yosef, Amar Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Akol Modim. Everybody admits everybody admits that in a situation where you had a relationship with a woman who's prohibited to you by kares, shavlad pagum, that the offspring is going to be defective. Man Akol Modim. Who is this one who says this? The offspring is going to be prohibited to marry a Kohen. This is Rabbi Yeshua. This is Rabbi Yeshua's position. Even though Rabbi Yeshua says that there's such a union, everybody else would say the union of somebody who's chayav kares would create a mamzer. Rabbi Yeshua says it's not. Rabbi Yeshua says that chayav krisus doesn't create a mamzer. You have to be chayav misa from a court to get mamzer. But nevertheless, granted, it's not a mamzer. Pagum miyahavi. But nevertheless, the offspring would be a pogrom, and you can't marry a Kohen, and mikal v'chomer mi'almana. And we learn out from a logical argument from a widow. And what's the argument? Ma'almana l'Kohen Gadol she'eni surah shava b'kol b'na pogrom. Just like a widow to a high priest, that the prohibition is not equivalent by everybody, the offspring is disqualified. Zu she'isura shava b'kol eino din she'b'na pogrom. For sure, this case where everybody is involved in this prohibition, the offspring is pagam. And if you want to break the Kal V'chomer and say a widow is different because she herself becomes disqualified, this woman too, who is involved in a situation where this woman too, this woman who is involved in a kares penalty, since her husband has categorized her as a zona because of this prohibited relationship, we're still going to say here too that the offspring is going to be defective and is not able to marry the Kohen. Okay, we'll stop here. God willing, we'll pick this up later.